Hey everybody, it's Pax. Social contract is a centuries-old concept discussed by many philosophers such as Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Immanuel Kant. It is a theoretical agreement or understanding among individuals that explores the mutual exchange of rights and duties between individuals in the society in which they participate. Social contract is usually explored in a societal and political context, but instead I'd like to talk about it in the context of a playgroup for Arkham Horror the card game. What does a social contract mean for a given group, whether it's an existing friend group or just people you met at a local game store and started up a scenario? Simply put, it is an encapsulation of the concessions that a player makes in order to approach the table and play in order to ensure that you all are enjoying your time spent on your hobby. The word rights in a card game isn't particularly useful to us, nor in most social interactions. You don't really have a right to someone else's attention or time. But I am interested in the idea of the duties you have to your fellow players in the group once you've agreed to play together, and how those duties may impact things like card choices and play patterns. So let's talk about it. Duties are obligations to fulfill responsibilities. When you sit down and agree to play, you take on an often unspoken understanding of responsibilities you have to other players. Long-standing and more successful groups may have a level of social cohesion that doesn't require discussions of those responsibilities. And some groups may require compromise and lengthy discussion to get to a healthy balance, so all players are enjoying their time. Ultimately, however, deviating from those responsibilities can result in a breakdown of your group as a result of failing to uphold your responsibilities to the social contract. There are a few key facets of the social contract as it pertains to Arkham Horror that will vary from table to table, so let's go over them. First is the rules. Implicit to all games, there's a rule set that should be followed and understood by all players to ensure that the game can be played. For analog games such as card games and board games, the rules are a bit of a special category because these games' rules are open to interpretation to a certain extent. There's nothing forcing you to play by the exact rules written in the book. Adjusting rules in order to make players at the table feel better about their experience is not entirely uncommon, whether it's adjusting how we pick our weaknesses, or giving a friend a break on the 19th autofail token they've pulled in a scenario. This is a lot less common in things like sports, where at a pickup game of baseball, all players will largely follow the rules of baseball. If a player joins a pickup game of baseball, it's expected they'll do things like try to hit the ball when it's pitched to them, or run in the outfield to catch a hit. If they fail to really interact with the common expectations of a baseball player, or even more specifically, the position they're put in on the field, other players may not be interested in having that player on their team. As another example, take video games, where the rules essentially are the game mechanics, and they're very hard to deviate from outside of hacking the game or otherwise cheating. In this regard, rules tend to be the least flexible part of the social contract from table to table, but nevertheless do have flexibility for house ruling, or including community-designed cards. But further to the specific rules of the card game, there's also the more top-down rule of cooperative games being cooperative, which leads to the next two facets of Arkham's social contract, the first of which is fair play. Everyone at the table wants the game to feel fair and equitable. In Arkham, this is typically dictated by the power level of players' decks at the table. For instance, some groups may be very happy to have everyone at the table building very strong decks to crush the game, whereas another group may approach the game with decks more interested in a narrative experience. And of course, there's always everywhere in between those two extremes to consider, as well as an individual's tolerance for having a less equitable game still feel fun. Each player has different expectations of what constitutes a fair game of Arkham, and those ideas can clash in ways that are destructive to a group. If one player is building decks that are accomplishing too much progress in a scenario too quickly, other players may feel as though their contributions are lesser than, and not enjoy the play experience. Conversely, if a player is too focused on an objective that isn't advancing the scenario's win condition, that could have other players feeling as though they're being forced to carry dead weight at the table. This one is especially tricky because everyone has different tastes for where to balance the narrative and efficiency in their own decks. But we're fortunate enough to be talking about a game that does a very good job marrying mechanics to theme. And oftentimes, narratively cohesive decks end up at reasonable levels of power to not be total deadweight, while also not stepping on other players' toes when it comes to contributing enough to the team. Next is cooperation. Everyone at the table should understand both the objective of the game and the objective of the other players, and work together to accomplish those objectives, which can be distinct objectives for one another. In Arkham, this can be muddied up by things like hidden cards that might force you to take strange turns, but ultimately, not many people will be too thrilled if you bring a deck designed to grief your friends. The objective of other players can be a lot trickier to understand and empathize with, and tends to result in the most interpersonal friction. Some players play to win. Some players play to explore the card pool. Some players play to explore the narrative. Either way, it's important for every player in a group to have a mutual understanding and respect of what parts of the game the other players enjoy the most, and ensure they're not infringing upon another player's fun. If someone wants to build a really complicated combo deck, all they need to do to not step on the feet of a player that wants to win the scenario is have the combo pay off at the end. And the last aspect of the social contract is communication. Everyone at the table wants to have a mutual understanding of the level of communication that is appropriate for that group. In the Learn to Play guide, the game suggests, but does not outright dictate, that the players should maintain some level of secrecy of the cards in their hand. For some groups, they may take this to heart and go as far as trying to roleplay their characters when speaking to one another. On the polar opposite, some groups will elect to ignore the suggestion entirely and play with open hands to have a more collaborative experience. There's a very wide range of communication preferences between those 2 points, and playing with any given group can result in a slightly different agreed-upon set of communication rules. Furthermore, players should feel as though they can talk openly and contribute freely to the group, and not be talked over. This is a fairly common problem known as quarterbacking or railroading in the cooperative board and card gaming world. This can be a really tricky problem to deal with, because ultimately, there's already a problem with the communication, and so communicating that there's a communication problem can just be really hard, either on the delivering end or on the receiving end. All of this brings me to a card that I find really fascinating because of how differently everyone seems to be evaluating it based on their preconceived notions of what is acceptable within the social contract of their playgroups. Heed the Dream is a 2-experience survivor event. It's a dilemma, and it has an ability that creates 3 piles of cards, 1 card from each player's deck in each pile. Together, the group chooses one of the piles for each player to draw their card from, and the remaining piles are removed from the game, with weaknesses being shuffled back into their owners' decks. So, on the positive side of the card, you're essentially looking at 3 cards per player and choosing 1 card per player to draw. That's a fairly strong amount of card draw in total for 1 card to do. It's more than Cryptic Research in a 4-player game, and it's decent quality card draw as well, digging like you would with a Eureka. But you're also choosing 2 cards per player to remove from the game permanently. Heed the Dream's most important metric of whether it's worth its experience cost is tied up in the implications it has for the social contract of the group. So let's go back to our categories and have a think about that. First off is rules. The card's wordy and has a bit of a process to it, but ultimately players shouldn't run into any issues agreeing on how the card plays correctly, but more so whether or not it should be allowed at the table at all based on the remaining factors. Fair play. Heed the Dream is not what I would consider an exceptionally strong card. It's a good amount of card draw for no resource cost into experience, but it doesn't really warp the game's balance in a way that will affect other players' perceptions of equitable power level across one another's decks. Strictly speaking, everyone's getting a card draw from this, so it's not going to result in one player hogging all the glory for themselves. But for cooperation, this is a really big problem. When a player at your table builds a deck that is trying to set up a combo of cards that have enough critical pieces that can't be lost for it to function, Heed the Dream is, over the course of enough play sessions, eventually going to lock them out of their combo. And this is a really critical point that I see a lot of players bring up, and I think it's a real bugbear of a problem. Humans have an innate negativity bias to protect us from future harm. And so if Heed the Dream helps assemble your combo 20 to 30 games in a row before it eventually dismantles it, the one game you end up unable to do what you wanted to do can feel so much worse in comparison, and completely overshadow any of those previous positive interactions. Ultimately, You can't take this card if someone else in the group likes to play in such a way that the card would be harmful to their game plan, or else it risks the players being unhappy with one another. Unhappiness leads to resentment, and resentment leads to the breakdown of almost any type of social tie. And finally, communication. Any group that struggles with railroading or quarterbacking could have a really hard time with this card, even if the players are on board with its effects. It's not hard to imagine a situation in which it could result in a player getting cards removed that they felt they needed, but couldn't adequately communicate to the group. Furthermore, groups that are heavier into a roleplay style of communication might struggle to stress the importance of cards in certain piles over others without feeling like they're compromising their preferred communication style. So, where am I even going with this? Well, all I'm really trying to do is point out an interesting phenomenon in the way that we're forced to evaluate certain cards based on them being in a social setting. Heed the Dream's cost is almost entirely a social cost, whether the group can withstand what it demands of them. The way that we treat our peers and the way our peers treat us can be a major source of frustration, just as much as it can be of no concern when you aren't encountering any problems. So if you find yourself in a play group where you don't feel any friction, it's valuable to reflect and wonder about the internal frictions other players may or may not be experiencing at the table. What duties have my fellow players followed through with to ensure I'm having such a great time? What duties am I fulfilling to my play group? And if you find yourself unable to identify any concessions you've made to your peers, I would encourage you to reach out to them and gently check to make sure that you're upholding your end of the social contract. No one likes confrontation, so getting ahead of problems shows an amount of care that will have other players at your table much more confident in upholding their duties to your play experience. Like so many things in life, it comes down to the golden rule: do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.